Susannah. As you heard, I am incredibly passionate about this responsible AI space, and I'm really excited to be working on building tools that make it easier for data scientists, for ML development teams, and for non-technical stakeholders to engage in the responsible AI development process. I'm going to guess that you all are here because you feel similarly. You probably have also seen a lot of things go wrong with production AI ML systems. You know, it's a gnarly world out there when you get into production, and a lot can go wrong. A lot of risk needs to be managed. So what we're going to do for the next 40 minutes is really talk about first of all, what is responsible AI? How can we define and measure the characteristics, the features that make an AI system responsible? And then what I want to do is actually give you some really tactical steps that you can start to do throughout your development lifecycle, from inception of an idea all the way through to putting your system into production and monitoring it in an ongoing fashion. If at any point in the talk you want to tweet at me, feel free. My handle is sh_shattuck. So I think the first thing that I want to get out of the way is the fact that there are a lot of different terms being thrown around. There's a lot of buzzword bingo when it comes to the responsible AI space. I'm very intentionally using the words responsible AI because I actually really prefer the concrete description of responsibility that we have as AI ML system developers versus more fuzzy terms like AI ethics or AI principles. I think there are a lot of different definitions out there in the market. There are a lot of frameworks. There are a lot of organizations that are talking about responsible AI, AI governance, ethical AI, and meaning very different things. And this is actually, I think, one of the biggest problems in this space right now. The lack of consensus, of standardized understanding, and standardized processes. And so one of the key things that I'm really passionate about and that we're trying to do at Credo AI is come up with a standard framework and process for us to use when we're thinking about evaluating whether or not a system is responsible. So one of the things I promised in the talk abstract, right, was that I'm going to move beyond buzzword bingo. I'm sorry, I haven't done a very good job of that yet. We've already thrown around words like MLOps and responsible AI. I'm going to do better. But in all seriousness, I think this is something that we all need to address as a technical community as well, is coming up with a standardized understanding of this concept. So what is responsible AI? Well, the good news is that there is a fair amount of consensus on sort of the high-level definition, the high-level features or characteristics, what I'm calling tenets here of a responsible AI system. So at a high level, a responsible AI system is fair, transparent, safe and secure, privacy-preserving, does not inflict a lot of social or environmental harm, and has the right accountability structures in place. So you may be thinking, okay, that all sounds nice, but what does that actually mean? And how the heck do I operationalize this in my development lifecycle? So I would like for us to move from thinking about these high-level concepts to thinking about these as measurable, actionable things. I want us as a data science community to be able to measure every single one of these features, both of our models and our data sets, the technical assets that we're creating, but also our processes and the people involved in the ML development lifecycle. And so I'll spend a little bit of time on this slide actually going through and talking about the ways that we are currently able to measure these different features. And I'll go through these from sort of most measurable, most well operationalized, to least measurable and most vague. And throughout this talk, I'm going to be talking about areas of active research where more work needs to be done. So I do want to make sure that we're all coming to this conversation with the understanding that this is not a solved problem in any way, shape, or form, right? And so in many ways, this is a call to action for us to continue to come up with better ways to measure these. And I'll be in the office hours room across the way if you want to have more conversations about that in greater detail. 40 minutes is not enough time to really go into all of that. But let's start with fairness. So how do we measure fairness? This is probably the most well operationalized responsible AI tenet. There are a lot of existing open source frameworks and tools that lay out some very effective ways of measuring the fairness of an AI/ML system. And there are two key dimensions to fairness that need to be measured: parity of outcomes and parity of performance. And which dimension that matters most for your use case is highly use case and context dependent. I'll give you an example. If you have a hiring system, we were just in the front row talking about AI hiring systems, you care about parity of outcomes because you don't want a system that violates what's known in HR as the 4/5 rule, the rule that you should be hiring minority candidates at a rate that is at least 80% of the rate at which you're hiring majority candidates. So you want to make sure that the outcomes that your system is delivering are fairly equal across different groups that are interacting with your system. You want a system that hires Black people at a rate that is fairly equal to the rate at which it hires white people, for example. Now, a cancer detection system, very different. You do not care about parity of outcomes. You do not want to predict that Black people have cancer at the same rate that white people do. You want to predict at the same accuracy level across all groups, because the most important thing for that system is for it to be accurate, to deliver an accurate diagnosis. So for that kind of system, parity of performance is the key dimension with which you measure fairness. So that's a brief discussion of fairness, but that's an example, I think, of a pretty well operationalized responsible AI tenet. We have an understanding of how to measure dimensions of fairness that we care about. We have metrics, we have tools that exist and have been well proven in industry to measure these things. Now, fairness is still a critical concern that I think a lot of organizations aren't properly taking into account. I'm by no means saying this is solved, but we want to get to the same place that we're in with fairness with all of these other principles, all of these other tenets. We want to be able to say these are the specific metrics or the specific technical characteristics and behavior that we can measure to prove that a system is transparent enough, to prove that a system is safe and secure enough, et cetera. So moving down the list, transparency is not just explainability. I think a lot of people use those terms interchangeably. Transparency is really about how well do people understand what your AI system does and how it does it. And so explainability is a critical piece, right? Understanding how specific feature inputs contribute to specific outputs. That's great. But there are a lot of other unsexy characteristics of transparency that are equally important. Things like disclosure. Do the people interacting with your AI system understand that it is an AI system? Do they understand what outputs that system is going to be providing? Documentation. Is there reasonable documentation available to the people interacting with your system so they can understand how it works? I think a lot of companies, raise up their hands and say, oh, we'd love to be transparent, but we have to protect our IP. We can't expose, our individual feature weights. And I think it's really important for us to think about evaluating and measuring a much fuller picture of transparency than just exposing the complete inner workings of an individual model or AI system. Safety and security are very well-solved areas for other technologies, for software, for robotics, less well-solved for AI-specific safety and security concerns. And so this is an area where there are emerging ways to measure things like adversarial robustness, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done in this space. So one of the things that we do at Credo AI is we try to pull in all of the best open source frameworks or approaches from academia for measuring these things, and we operationalize them in an open source assessment framework, which I'll be talking about at the very end of my presentation. And we are seeing that there are more and more open source projects related to assessing safety and security of AI systems. So I'm excited by the movement that I see in this space, but there's definitely a lot more work that needs to be done to turn this into something truly measurable in a concrete way. And the same holds true for privacy. There are more and more open source privacy AI-specific frameworks. Now, I do think that there's a lot of work that is important for responsible AI that happens at the data set level. But when it comes to privacy, there has not been enough work at the model level, really understanding things like the possibility of data leakage, particularly in these large generative models that are increasingly popular. So coming up with ways to measure how privacy preserving not only your data set and data set processes and practices are is critical, but also how privacy preserving is the actual model that you're delivering in production. Okay, now we come to the two big elephants in the room, right? Social and environmental well-being and accountability. How the heck do you measure these things? So these are by far the two sort of least measurable tenets of responsible AI in this space. But we're working on changing that. So social and environmental well-being, I like to think of as what are the negative real-world feedback loops that your system could cause, and how are we going to prevent those feedback loops? How are we going to stop them? A great example are content recommendation systems that trap people in content bubbles. That is a very damaging real-world negative feedback loop that was not accounted for in the design and development of those systems. And so I actually think that the most measurable thing that we can look at right now to understand this tenet of responsible AI is, have you asked questions about what your potential negative feedback loops are? And do you have mitigation plans in place for the ones that you've uncovered? And we'll talk a lot more about the actual process of doing that. I think one of the reasons why this is such a hard nut to crack in a measurable way is that it's an incredibly multidisciplinary problem. You cannot answer this question with just technical data, technical information alone. And that's actually one of the reasons why I've moved away from the MLOps and ML monitoring space to think more holistically about AI governance, because I think if we get too stuck in just thinking about the technical aspects of our systems, we lose sight of the forest through the trees. We lose this core tenet of responsible AI. Okay, and then lastly, accountability. How do we measure accountability of our AI development process? So this is really all about understanding who is accountable at every decision point in your process, and making sure that you have an auditable record of those decisions that you can go back to understand if something does go wrong, or if something goes in a way that you didn't expect, tracing back that decision to say, hey, this is what we thought was gonna happen. Let's make sure that we do that differently in the future. So accountability, I like to think of as more of something that we measure in our process rather than we measure in our models. But this is an emerging space that a lot of regulators are also paying attention to when it comes to things like legal liability. You know, if a self-driving car hits somebody, the famous trolley problem, who's at fault? I'm thinking more about accountability in this talk as the process accountability than that legal liability, but that's an important dimension as well that I wanted to mention. So I know this is a lot. We have 6 new things that we need to measure at every step of the development lifecycle. So how are we actually going to do that? Well, I am going to now share with you what I have seen work well at the customers that I've worked with that are trying to implement responsible AI practices. You really need to integrate this into your development lifecycle. And this is the way that a lot of companies start. They have the normal AI development lifecycle, right? This all looks familiar. And they add an extra step, probably right before the model is deployed, some kind of responsible AI check-in or risk and compliance review. And look, if you're doing things like this, you're doing a responsible AI check-in. Like, that's great. I'm excited. But we can do better because this is actually almost guaranteed to give you bad outcomes, to not deliver on your goals of actually building responsible AI systems. Let me explain why. This has everything to do with incentive alignment. So at this point in the development lifecycle, there are a lot of decisions that have already been made. There is a lot of money that has probably already been spent. There is a lot of time that has already been spent. You've gone through the effort of procuring a training data set. That was probably painful. You've gone through the process of experimentation, building a model. You finally found one that meets your performance requirements. That was probably painful. You even picked a use case, right? That's a sort of implicit step in the development lifecycle. You decided to apply AI/ML to something. All of those decisions are very difficult to walk back on at this point in the life cycle where you're about to deploy. The team that worked on this thing is very excited to launch. They're so close to getting their work into production. They are not going to be excited about this responsible AI check-in. They are going to see this as a blocker. And let me tell you, we work with a lot of newly formed AI oversight or AI governance teams at our Credo AI customers. And almost all of them say the same thing to me when we start working together. They say, Susannah, I am desperate to be seen as a business enabler, not a business blocker. How can you help me? And the first thing I tell them is that if they're doing their AI governance process like this, I can't help them. They are going to be seen as a blocker. So the way to get out of this trap where you can't really achieve much by doing your responsible AI check-in at this step, you can't really walk back on a lot of those decisions, is to instead integrate these check-ins, these moments of assessment and measurement throughout the development lifecycle at every single step. And this is completely transformative for the culture of a development team. I've seen development teams transform the way they work by doing this. They go from being reactive about responsible AI issues that end up, being sticking points right before they go into production to being proactive, to actually having moments where they are being asked to consider what might go wrong with this system rather than just responding to the things that go wrong. And the other amazing thing about doing it like this is that you actually reduce the burden of responsible AI check-ins and assessment by spreading it out over a much longer timescale and doing discrete types of assessments at different moments in time. Whereas before, it was this incredibly arduous process that, I kid you not, at some of our customers, this responsible AI check-in results in a 50-page Confluence document that somebody has to go through and read and review. That is an incredibly arduous process. To being something that happens at 1 hour intervals across the many months that you're working on this project. So if there's one thing that you take away from this talk, right, it's that if you're thinking about doing responsible AI assessment, if you're thinking about adopting a responsible AI development process, you need to do it throughout. It cannot be a single moment in time that you're doing that check-in. Now, you might wonder, what does the check-in look like across all of these different moments? So this is a rough map, right? This is the template that we suggest. There are a lot of different ways to do this, but the rough guide is that at the very beginning, when somebody, whether it's the CEO of your company or the VP of sales or whoever, when they have an idea and they say, go apply AI to this problem, that triggers the first responsible AI assessment, which is a use case review, which is all about thinking through the unintended consequences of applying AI/ML to that problem. And this is the best moment to bring in a multi-stakeholder, diverse team to sit down and talk through those consequences. And the result of that use case review is going to be that you have a list of potential harms. That is your roadmap for your responsible AI development process. Throughout the development process, you should be making sure that you are mitigating every single one of those harms. And so that comes to the next step, which we call alignment at Credo AI. This is about defining the specific requirements, the responsible AI requirements that your system must meet. In the exact same way that you have business requirements, performance requirements, cost requirements, you need to have fairness requirements, transparency requirements, security requirements, et cetera. And this step will give you the specific roadmap for how you're going to measure and assess each of those tenets during your training and development. And so that's when you actually move into using tools like AI Fairness 360 or Microsoft's Responsible AI Toolkit or our open source framework, Credo AI Lens, to run assessments, run technical assessments on your models and your data sets. And if you've done all of that, then by the time you get to that validation step before going into deployment, you're pretty confident that your system is going to meet that set of requirements you've been testing all along. And so at this point, the risk and compliance review isn't a blocker. It's a validation of all of the hard work that you've already put in. And it can happen a lot faster. You probably aren't going to uncover some huge catastrophic risk that causes you to go back to the drawing board. it's a much easier process if you've been doing all that hard work up front. But of course, we all know with machine learning systems, it doesn't end there. You have to continue to manage and monitor responsible AI features of your system in production in the exact same way that you have to continue to monitor and manage performance. And so when you deploy, that's when you need to be giving all of your documentation, your disclosure assets to everybody who's going to be impacted by that system. And then you need to conduct ongoing responsible AI audits and monitor for responsible AI features or metrics in production. Easy, right? That's it. You're doing responsible AI if you do this. If only it were that easy, right? I think a lot of organizations are recognizing that they need to move in this direction, but it's painful because it slows you down. And I want to be very upfront about that. It will slow you down a little bit. And one of the things that we're trying to do at Credo AI is to make this process less friction-filled, to make it easier, to reduce the cost, quote unquote, of doing this process the right way so that it's a no-brainer, right? So that it's so obvious that there's no reason why you wouldn't. And so what I'm going to talk about now are the specific things that you should do to achieve this end goal of having responsible AI assessment incorporated into your entire development lifecycle. So the TLDR from that section of the talk, the end of part one, during design, during development, and during deployment, there are specific responsible AI things that you need to do. And the most important point that I want to hammer home is that this is not something that a data science team, that a technical team can or should do alone. This is a multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary problem. There are a lot of really hard questions that you're going to have to answer during this process, and you need to be bringing in not only diverse stakeholders from your own organization, but also from regulators, from impacted populations. You need to be getting a diverse set of perspectives to solve these problems. Great. So now let's go into the tactical part of the conversation. I want to share with you across the design phase, the development phase, and the deployment phase some specific things that you can and should do to make sure that your systems are responsible. So the use case review at the beginning and the defining and aligning on responsible AI metrics, your technical responsible AI assessment plan, is by far the hardest step of this process. And it's really hard because, again, it's requiring you to imagine what the potential risks of your system are, and then think about how to mitigate those risks. And so we at Credo AI have developed a set of questions that we encourage our customers to ask themselves in this phase to do that most effectively. And these questions really center around who, what, and how. Who is going to be impacted by your AI system? What is the AI system going to do for or to these people? And how are you going to mitigate those potential impacts? Mitigate or encourage, right? If it's a benefit, then you want to make sure that the system does it. If it's a harm, you want to mitigate. And so we really encourage people to think broadly here about the who, not just the direct users of your system, but also the indirect users. I'll call back to my cancer detection system example. The directly impacted person is the patient. They're the one who's being predicted to have cancer or not. They are a critical stakeholder. But you also have the doctors, who are probably the actual users of the system. They're the ones who probably receive the recommendation from your model about whether or not their patient has cancer. You need to consider what their needs are and what the impacts on their work are as you're evaluating the impact of your system. And I'll give you an example. Trust is something that's really critical in healthcare systems, because if your doctor doesn't trust the output of your cancer detection model, they're probably not going to go and give that diagnosis. They're going to want to run the analysis themselves, which might be more expensive, more time-consuming, less accurate. So in addition to having to manage the accuracy and performance and fairness for the patient, you need to manage trust for the doctor. Another great way to think about potential harms is by looking at the regulatory environment that your use case will be operating in. Because regulations are designed, and this might be a controversial statement, but I believe the regulations are usually designed to mitigate harm. They're designed to address some kind of negative impact that has been uncovered in the world. And so if you look to your regulatory environment, you will get actually a pretty good guide of some of the really critical harms that need to be addressed. Like HIPAA in the context of healthcare is a very good guide for understanding what are all the ways in which patient data could be mishandled or misused. That should be your guide for thinking about how privacy preserving your cancer detection system needs to be, for example. And then the last piece, how do we measure and mitigate negative impacts? This is really all about translating those harms that you've uncovered into actual metrics, things that you can test for and things that you can make sure that you're mitigating during your development life cycle. And that translation of harms to metrics is really difficult. So that's where there are a set of tools that are being developed. And these tools range from open source tools like the Akitas framework, which helps you understand how to actually define and measure fairness for a given use case. Highly recommend checking it out if you haven't. Industry standards and benchmarks, right? Those help you define what good looks like. We still have a long way to go with this, but organizations like NIST are starting to chip away at this work. And then tools like Credo AI are designed to help you do that translation from potential harms to metrics. So again, I'll be in the room across the way if you want to learn anything more about that and what we're doing. But this responsible AI alignment step is really, really hard, and you all should be leveraging as many tools as you can in this process to make sure that you're doing it the right way. So that's designing. What about when we actually go into development? So development is all about figuring out what model best fits my constraints, right? And the normal constraints, the constraints for the last many years have been usually performance and cost, right? What's the most performant model that I can make that meets my cost limitations? Responsible AI metrics further constrain your problem space. So it's not just about what's the most performant model that I can build at the right price point. It's about what is the most performant model that is also meeting my fairness constraints, my transparency constraints, my privacy constraints, et cetera. And I think that this is a really important thing for data scientists and ML engineers to understand is you have to really incorporate these metrics into the trade-off decisions that you're making about the best models to pick, which means that this can't be something that happens at the end. Like this just further validates the fact that you need to be measuring these aspects of your system all along the way. You need to be incorporating fairness metrics into your objective function. You need to be incorporating robustness metrics into your objective function. The other key thing to remember is that it's not just about your models. You also need to be assessing your data. It's actually a lot cheaper and easier to solve responsible AI problems by solving them in the data than solving them in the model. If you have biased data, if you have data that is not correctly privacy preserving, it's going to be a lot harder to fix the resulting biased or not privacy preserving model than it is to just go back to the data and fix the problems there. The other key thing that you can do during development, which reduces a lot of the challenges that we have around models not actually making it into production and being really expensive, a total waste of time and money to develop. Rule out model methodologies from the beginning. Rule out data sets from the beginning that don't meet your requirements. If you identify that explainability is a core requirement, a regulatory requirement, or an end user requirement, don't use an unexplainable model type architecture. Like it's again, just so critical to do these things at the beginning, to define your responsible AI requirements at the beginning, because that will save you a lot of wasted time and effort. Then the last piece, I am sure I don't have to hammer this home to all of you in this room, you're here, but you need to document everything that you're doing during the development process, every decision that you're making, not just because it's a good idea for reproducibility and all of that, but it's critical for transparency and it's critical for accountability. two of those core tenets. And so actually one of the things that we're trying to do at Credo AI is make documentation of responsible AI features and development processes less painful. Okay, what about in deployment? What are the things that you need to do in deployment? Monitoring is great. I've worked in the monitoring space for many years. Every company should have machine learning monitoring in place. If you don't currently, we should probably have a serious chat. Performance monitoring, that's great. Drift monitoring, even better. Whenever possible, try to monitor responsible AI metrics as well. Fairness monitoring, if you have ground truth. Now, the challenge with monitoring is that ground truth is not always easily available. Or if it is, it's on a much longer time scale than your monitoring is valuable for. So this is where stress tests and audits come into play as well. For those things that you do not have access to ground truth for, that are difficult to monitor for, you should be conducting regular, at least quarterly audits. And a random audit from an independent team within your organization is also a really good way to check if your documentation is good enough. So audits are great for a lot of reasons. But this is something that I think a lot of organizations are not doing today. They do this responsible AI check-in once, and then they think all is good. We passed, we're all green, put it into production. I never have to think about fairness of this system again. But that is not the case. These systems are learning and changing over time. So we need to make sure that they're continuing to meet our expectations and requirements. You also need to make sure that you're getting non-technical feedback, not just monitoring data and technical audit results, but also qualitative feedback from your end users. Every AI system that is put into production needs to have some kind of feedback mechanism. And this is where, again, I think that there's some lack of imagination when it comes to figuring out what are the different ways to get feedback. It's not just about a customer support channel. There are a lot of great ways to introduce simple thumbs up, thumbs down, tell me more kind of buttons into your user experience. And getting that feedback is one of the best ways to identify potential harms that you didn't think of in the beginning. So you need to be open to that. The last thing, I was a Girl Scout. Be prepared. I'm all about it. And you need to be prepared for things to go wrong. Things will go wrong. Even if you do this process perfectly every single time, there will be issues that arise in production. And a key aspect of the responsibility in responsible AI is being responsible for when things go wrong. And having a mitigation plan, having a specific person who's responsible for implementing that mitigation plan for responsible AI issues in production. So I think probably if you're anything like many of the organizations that I've worked with, you might be sitting there sweating in your seat, because I'm going to guess that there are a lot of things that I just talked about that you're not currently doing. So I just want to first say that's normal. Very few organizations have truly operationalized this responsible AI process that I just described to you. But I think this is like one of the most pressing challenges of our time and our community's responsibility is to get from where we are today, where we don't even know what systems we have in production in many organizations, to really deeply feeling confident in the way that our systems are going to behave in production, feeling confident that they're going to meet our requirements. So I want to just end, and then we'll do a quick Q&A, with a quick plug for something that I mentioned a couple times during the presentation, Credo AI Lens. So this is, in many ways, Lens's coming out ceremony. We have just released this framework into open source, so it's available, and we're very excited for all of you to try it out. Lens is a responsible AI assessment framework. It's a Python-based framework, and we very much believe that what you can't observe, you can't control. So Lens is designed to help you observe those 6 responsible AI tenets that I described at the beginning of my talk, so that you can make better development decisions, deployment decisions based on them. And so the way that Lens works, it's a combination of a lot of best-in-class existing open source libraries like AIF 360, Microsoft's RAI toolkit, as well as additional modules and capabilities that we've built out ourselves, like dataset assessment for fairness, an NLP model assessment tool that looks at things like toxicity. And we combine all of these capabilities into what we call modules, which you can string together to generate any kind of assessments that you want. And Lens will run those assessments on your models and your data sets and output these HTML reports, as well as just a static list of metrics. And the reports have pretty charts in them and descriptions. All of that comes out of the box. And the goal is that Lens is not only a tool that helps a technical team do these assessments more efficiently and effectively, but also creates outputs that are legible and useful for non-technical teams as well. And so we are very excited to have data scientists from this event go out and try this out, and we would love to hear from you about A, whether these assessments are useful for you, and B, what the response is from your other stakeholders when you share with them the outputs of Lens. And so this slide just has a list of our current capabilities. We were pretty specifically focused on fairness for a while, but now we're expanding to privacy, explainability. But we right now have a full suite of fairness and performance assessments available. The documentation link is down below, credoai-lens.readthedocs.io. As I said, this is our coming out party, so we're eager for feedback. And if you want to talk more about Lens or anything that I just shared in this presentation, again, I'll be in the room across the hall for office hours, and I'd love to hear from any of you about your current challenges, goals, hopes, and dreams related to responsible AI adoption. So with that, thank you so much. I am available now for, I think, 5 minutes of Q&A.